commercials. What the American public doesn't know is what makes them the American public, all right?
Every day, people all over the world are told what to think. Well, at least they're told what to think about. That's what Marshall McLuhan stated in his media theory, in which he described a global village. The media constructs the agendas and tells us what is important. Well, this theory has been expanded on many times over the years, and two researchers in particular, Donald Shaw and Maxwell McCombs, offered the idea that the media sets an agenda and frames the way in which the publics view the story. This is a three-step process at work. First, the journalists, editors, and producers select what is to be transmitted. This process is called priming. Much like when one primes a pump to get water to run more immediately, the media primes the public to know what is important. In doing this, the media sets the public agenda. Once the public agenda is set, people are talking about that topic, and that conversation interacts with our leaders. Finally, our leaders today look to public opinion to set the public policy. Too often, they simply do what's polling well. They give the people what they want, regardless of how informed the people actually are. So do we get all the news in the United States? Are we truly an informed society? To answer these questions, I'm going to examine the news stories as related to the rise of the Islamic State, or ISIL, in the spring and summer of 2014. I ran these internet searches based on these dates because June 12th was the date ISIS took over Mosul in Iraq, and August 19th was the date the first beheading was aired on the internet. I will examine the press in the United Kingdom leading up to these events, and I will also look at newspapers in the Middle East as well as Jazeera and how they reported on this. Then we're going to turn to the United States and examine very closely what the United States was reporting on in June, July, and August of 2014 while ISIS was gaining power and taking over certain areas of Iraq and Syria. So I'd like to begin with an opinion piece. On May 21st, the UK's Telegraph published a story by Bob Crowley stating that Al-Qaeda was not yet defeated in Afghanistan. At the same time, we were negotiating exiting the region. On June 18th, the British Broadcasting Corporation released a video in which they outlined some of the atrocities that were being committed by ISIS. Here is a brief snippet of that video. On June 22nd, The Telegraph in the UK published this story. The headline reads, "Britain will face costs of Islamic extremism for many years." And it outlines the issues at hand and how important action is to take immediately. And on June 30th, the UK's The Guardian published a story. This headline reads, "ISIS declares caliphate in Iraq and Syria." These stories were just a few of the stories published in June in the United Kingdom about ISIS. Clearly, the threat of a rising Islamic State was taken seriously by journalists in the United Kingdom. But they have good reason for that. The United Kingdom has had a very liberal immigration policy with regard to Muslims from the Middle East, and this has caused Muslim population to explode there. London in particular has seen its share of Muslim extremist terrorism. They have been attacked in their tube system, they are attacked on the streets. Why, in fact, last year, a British soldier was beheaded in broad daylight by a Muslim extremist committing jihad. It has also been proven that the United Kingdom has a problem with homegrown terrorists. These terrorists align themselves with ISIS. But in the Middle East, however, it's a very different story. The people there are Muslim, and religion is a part of their everyday life. It is interwoven within the very fabric of their community. And they have been present as the United States and our allies have bombed and invaded their countries. It doesn't matter what the reason is. All they know is that we bombed them and we've invaded them. They have a very different perspective. This story was printed in the Al-Ahram Weekly, which is an Egyptian newspaper, and it simply defines who ISIS is and answers the questions I'm sure the people of the region had as to who they were and what exactly it is they were doing. The same newspaper, the Al-Ahram Weekly, published a story on July 3rd asking, why did Mosul welcome ISIS? The journalist ridicules the security forces in Baghdad as they were trained by American forces. And he states the following: the lesson of Iraqi politicians inviting the intervention of US or the UK for regime change should now be clear to all. This journalist blamed the United States and its allies for the uprising of ISIL. On June 19th, Al Jazeera English filed this report on how ISIS had become a major force with only a few thousand fighters. There is a quote at the end of the story that reads, "It is the worst of all worlds. Wealthy outside donors and state sponsorship across the Persian Gulf, and the ability to raise lots of money locally." And in Jordan, the Jordan Times reported on June 29th that ISIL had declared themselves world leaders. The story references a report that was issued by the Safan Group. The Safan Group is an international intelligence and security agency that has offices in New York, London, Doha, and Singapore. The report referenced was compiled in May of 2014 and released in June. It describes the number of fighters ISIL has and where they come from. It also detailed how they obtain recruits, retain members, and what their goals are. Well, clearly there are different storylines being presented to people in different countries. The United Kingdom obviously sees ISIS as a threat, whereas perhaps some news organizations in Egypt may not see them as quite as big of a threat as they do in the UK. Clearly, news agencies are reporting for their public. The story can be framed many different ways. By choosing what to report, each news organization gives their readers the path upon which they will reason the situation for themselves and come to their own conclusion. The public's opinions are formed by the journalist's decisions on what to report and what not to report. So let's come back to the United States. Let's take a look now at what the United States was reporting during this same time period. We're first going to start with the Associated Press. Now, the Associated Press is the main source of news for our journalists here in the United States. They're the ones that hire the journalists, and then they sell those stories to all of the different news outlets. So, from June 18th, which was the same day the BBC published their video on ISIS that we saw earlier, let's see what they thought the top stories of the day were. The head of our NSA testified in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee that our surveillance program has thwarted more than 50 terrorist plots to attack U.S. citizens, including one that planned to attack the U.S. Stock Exchange. The Taliban and USA are holding talks to reach a political solution to end more than 12 years of war in Afghanistan. The international coalition officially handed over control to the Afghan army today. After leaving the G8 summit, President Obama will spend 24 hours in Germany. 50 years after President Kennedy's famous Cold War address in Berlin. Wednesday, President Obama will give a speech at Germany's famous Brandenburg Gate. And finally, U.S. stocks moved higher today based on news of lower inflation and home building starts. But investors still have their eye on the Federal Reserve to see if they are planning on keeping the stimulus programs in place. NPR ran a story that did mention ISIS in the month of June, but as I read this story, it came to my attention that the gist of it was that what's going on in Iraq could be an embarrassment to the Obama administration. I ran an archive search on ABC News Online. The search indicated that from June 1 to November 15th, ABC News had filed 269 stories on ISIS. And of those 269 stories, 17 were ran in the month of June through July 7th. On July 5th, ABC News filed a story about the Iraqi terror leader's first video appearance, and then a story about how a teenager fell in love with a member of ISIS and planned to join him. So from the beginning of July till August 13th, there wasn't much, if any, reporting on ISIS being done in the United States mainstream media. Is there a reason for that? Was nothing going on? Were they not doing anything? Was ISIS not still marching across Iraq and Syria and arming themselves and growing in size and in power? Well, they were, but it wasn't being reported on here. So let's look at whether or not there was a reason for that. And I think to do that, we have to first look at who the reporters are. Here is a copy of a Pew Research poll that indicates where the news organizations fall on their political leanings. This chart was published by the Pew Research Center, and as you can see, the vast majority of all mainstream news outlets in the United States lean to the left. There are only a few that lean to the right and a few in the middle. In May, the Washington Post reported on a study done by two professors at the Indiana University. In this study, they found that the number of reporters and journalists in America that side to the left, or Democrats, are at an all-time high. Only 7% of journalists today refer to themselves as Republican or right-leaning. With so many of our reporters, journalists, and editors leaning to the left, one has to ask themselves, are they supporting the agenda of the White House? After all, our president has set forth this agenda.
As a candidate for president, I pledge to bring the war in Iraq to a responsible end for the sake of our national security and to strengthen American leadership around the world. After taking office, I announced a new strategy that would end our combat mission in Iraq and remove all of our troops by the end of 2011.
And he was in the process of removing our troops when this happened.
An American journalist has been beheaded by ISIS terrorists. A video showing the horrific killing and its gruesome aftermath was released on the internet a short while ago, along with a message.
The terrorist organization the American media seemed to want to ignore murdered one of their own. A freelance reporter by the name of James Foley was beheaded by a member of ISIS. The man that committed that murder was from the UK. The UK has reason to be worried. The UK sounds the alarm. That day, Americans were exposed to the brutal truth of ISIS, what they want, who they were, and what they wanted to do. They're on an end-of-days mission. That's the day the media started priming the pump about ISIS. That's the day ISIS became a part of our everyday conversation. That's the day the media set the agenda to force our leaders to deal with ISIS. The media has an awesome power, and it is one they should never, ever forget. Every day, they tell us what to think about. Every day, they are the ones that set the narrative in this country. They have an awesome power, but they should take that power very seriously. Because I wonder, had the media paid attention back in June, had the media primed the ISIS pump all through June and into July and all through the summer, would James Foley have met a different fate? On November 4th, Catherine Herridge of Fox News filed a report stating that our federal government knew the location of James Foley, yet postponed a rescue mission back in May until it was too late.